John, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
You're welcome.
So Spanish flu, something what we call Spanish flu or Great Influenza of 1918, you wrote a book about it, and that pandemic killed between 50 and 100 million people. Is it accurate?
That number first came out of a Nobel laureate named McFarland Burnett, who spent most of his life studying influenza. And, that was more than 50 years ago. He came up with that estimate. And since then, some modern epidemiologists have actually pretty much confirmed it. I think the lowest credible total today is probably about 35 million dead, but there seems to have been a consensus that's formed around at least 50 million. And of course, the world was less than a quarter of the population of today. So you adjust for population, be the equivalent of 225 to 450 million dead, which is almost inconceivable.
Yeah, there is a line in the book that kind of puts it in perspective. It says, the Great Influenza killed more people in a year than Black Death of the Middle Ages killed in a century. It killed more people in 24 weeks than AIDS has killed in 24 years. I actually checked this morning. AIDS killed between 30 to 50 million.
Right.
As of this date, it's still behind. What made it that lethal?
It was a pretty nasty virus, much more lethal than COVID. And in addition, a lot of the deaths were secondary bacterial pneumonia. The virus essentially wiped out a lot of the physical barriers that the immune system presents to infection in the lung, along the throat, and bacteria could march right down into the lung that normally wouldn't have gotten there. So it's not clear how many deaths, but a lot were from secondary bacterial pneumonias. Today, bacterial pneumonia following influenza still has a case mortality rate of 6 to 8%. So even with modern antibiotics and ICUs and so forth, you would still get enormous numbers of dead from a comparable virus. And the reality is, because of the different age groups that were the targets of the influenza, the 1918 pandemic, in a lot of ways, it's more lethal than even the gross numbers sound. For example, Metropolitan Life concluded that over 3% of all the industrial workers in insured died. And so that would translate, if you figure roughly 20 to 30% of them got sick in the first place, that probably translates to a 10 to 12% case mortality rate. And people, that was age 20 to 50. That was actually one of the prime targets. This is an almost unbelievable statistic I'm about to quote, that children under the age of 5 died at a rate equal to the number of kids today who die from all causes over a 26-year period. And 2/3 of the deaths in 1918 were compressed into a period of 14 or 15 weeks. I mean, COVID's lasted, we're still dealing with it 4 years out, whereas there were waves in 1918. It did last until 1920, but the vast majority of deaths came in a very short time frame in the fall of 1918.
So what was the reason that it was targeting primarily younger, most healthy people? Is it the immune system was basically destroying themselves?
That's the leading hypothesis. We don't know for certain, but ironically, COVID kills the elderly because their immune systems are weaker.
Mm-hmm.
They can't fight as hard. The 1918 virus killed younger people because their immune system was stronger and the immune system overreacted. It has many very lethal weapons. It threw every weapon it had at the virus, and the battlefield was the lung. And the lung was destroyed while it was trying to kill the virus. As I say, that's a leading hypothesis. It's one that makes the most sense.
So the way the book is structured is that there are several lines. It starts with a discussion of medical field, then talks about Woodrow Wilson and World War I, and then influenza, and then all that's kind of combined into one big story. So I wanted to ask you about the state of medical field in the end of 19th century, because that blew my mind away. I had no idea what it was.
In the U.S., it had been extraordinarily backward in most of the 19th century. You could graduate with a medical degree from Harvard if you pass 5 out of 9 courses, meaning you fail 4 of them. And Harvard changed that after one doctor didn't know the lethal dose. One recent graduate didn't know the lethal dose of morphine, killed several patients in a row. So they decided, well, maybe we better get a little bit stricter. Most medical schools, anyone who could pay the tuition was accepted. That began to change when Johns Hopkins was created. Hopkins set a model based on German institutions. Number one, you needed a college degree, you needed scientific background, and, it was very rigorous. And other medical schools, the best ones anyway, copied Hopkins. There was University of Pennsylvania, there's Washington University, Harvard, Columbia, but that really didn't happen until the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And the revolution in American medicine occurred with extraordinary speed. There was a report called the Flexner Report in 1910 or 1911. I've forgotten the exact date. It was a muckraking report about how bad medical schools were. As a result, within a couple of years, the vast majority of medical schools in the United States actually closed. Those that remained open all met pretty good standards. And since then, there is no bad medical school anymore in the United States, and probably not anywhere in the advanced world. Some may be better than others, but they're all very good, and they're all very competitive. So you had a younger generation of physicians trained, after 1900 who were equal to the best physicians and scientists anywhere in the world. And even going back to the 19th century, many American physicians, they were very serious about what they were doing, and they went to Europe for training. To quote William Welch, who's really the father of American medicine and easily the most important person in the history of American medicine, and arguably the most important person in the history of American science, as he said, the results were much better than the system. The system was terrible. I've described that, but quite a few people went to Europe for training, which compensated for their poor education in the United States.
You talk about Welch quite a bit in the book. What was his primary achievement? How was he instrumental to improving the medical profession?
Well, it's funny. He was clearly a brilliant man, and he seemed to know everything. He could walk into a room and lecture on practically any specialty. But his own research, while it was solid, it wasn't earth-shattering. It was a charisma that he had, and an inspirational ability, and the ability to judge other people. So he was the first dean of the Hopkins Medical School. He set the standard there. He recruited incredibly good faculty, which drew the best students. He then seeded, with his recommendations, other medical schools throughout the country. As the president of one university said, they'd be a fool to hire someone who didn't have Welch's imprimatur. So he's more like a conductor of an orchestra. Again, he did very good, solid scientific research himself, but it wasn't the kind of earth-shattering. His gift was not as much in the laboratory as it was in inspiring and handling people. Almost all of them were men. There actually were very few women at that time, but I mentioned a couple in the book.
So the events of the book, and actually not just the book, those events are happening during World War I. Woodrow Wilson is the president. What was the environment in the country overall, like under his rule?
It was probably the most oppressive in American history, more so than in World War II, more so than in the Civil War. The Congress, at his urging, passed a law making it punishable by 20 years in prison to utter, write, print, or publish any disloyal, scurrilous, or profane language about the government of the United States. Kind of interfered with free speech. You couldn't criticize the war effort. The government actually prosecuted people for that. And the virus, which surfaced first in the spring of 1918, there was a very mild first wave that didn't hit every city by any stretch. The virus then mutated into a lethal wave in the fall. So the virus arrived in this atmosphere of fear. Everything was focused on the war and winning the war. Wilson never made a single public statement of any kind about the influenza pandemic. As a result, you had national public health figures saying things like, this is ordinary influenza by another name. As you said earlier, it was referred to as the Spanish flu, not because it started in Spain, but because Spain wasn't at war. So the Spanish press was writing about it and picked up the name Spanish flu. So you have people saying, you have, as I quoted an instant ago, this is ordinary influenza by another name. It wasn't ordinary influenza by another name. People knew that because they saw their neighbors, spouses, kids die sometimes 24 hours after the first symptoms, often with horrific symptoms, which included bleeding from the eyes and ears, not exactly ordinary influenza. So when people are being told stuff that they know without any question is a lie, they have nowhere to turn. They can't trust anything. And this led to certainly alienation and in some cases almost a disintegration of the society. You have the fear that's going to be there anyway because of the danger that the disease presents. And then you layer on top of that the fact that you can't trust anything or anybody. It just exacerbated the fear. And in some instances, it almost led to a disintegration. There's a sober, serious scientist named Victor Vaughan, who before the war was the dean of the University of Michigan Medical School, one of the best med schools, and during the war became a colonel in the Army. And he said right at the peak of the pandemic, said if the current rate of acceleration continues a few more weeks, civilization could disappear from the face of the earth. So that's how bad it got. Fortunately, that acceleration did not continue. Pandemic peaked and started to recede. One of the biggest differences between COVID and the 1918 pandemic is timing. Because in 1918, everything happened much, much faster. The influenza virus moves faster. Its incubation period shorter. You're sick shorter. You shed virus for a shorter period of time. Serial transmission is shorter. As horrific as it was in any given city, they tended to deal with it for no more than 10 weeks, sometimes less than that. And worldwide, that second wave lasted from probably about the middle of September through the end of the year. But it was a little bit cycled. So no place had to deal with it for 3 or 4 months at a row. Then you had another wave in the spring and another wave in 1920. And they were pretty bad, but they were nothing like the fall wave.
Let's step back a little and talk about what do we know about the origin of it? And the second thing is, how did it spread from that small county or whatever we think it was?
Well, we don't really know anything about the origin. Actually, in the book, I hypothesized that there was an area in Kansas where it jumped species. I don't push that hypothesis anymore. The book originally came out 20 years ago, almost exactly as we tape this. And there's been a lot of epidemiological work since the book was published. My personal thinking right now is it probably started in China. It may have started in Kansas, as I proposed in the book. Other leading theories are it started in France in 1915. There's another theory it started in Vietnam. We really don't know where it started. What we do know is the influenza virus has its genetic code is contained instead of on a continuous strand of RNA on 8 separate segments of RNA. There are more than 8 genes, but there are 8 segments. And at least 7 of those segments came directly from birds. And the 8th may have passed through another mammal or may also have come directly from birds. So it was very foreign to the human population. That probably was partly accounting for its lethality and the way the immune system overreacted. I'd never seen anything like this before. But I'm not an immunologist. I probably shouldn't have said that. Makes sense to me. But
some of the biggest area of spreading seemed like took place in camps, right, where a lot of soldiers were lumped together. Yeah. Can you explain why that was the case?
Well, obviously the crowding. You have a World War I Army barracks is not exactly roomy. You had bunks stacked on top of each other. The Army tried to make some adjustments. For example, one soldier's head lays on bed, the next soldier would make his bed so that his feet were where his colleagues' head was. But, in those barracks, pretty hard to isolate or protect yourself in a situation like that. So, and in addition, everybody in the Army camp, with the exception maybe of a couple of senior officers, would have been in the age group that was the target demographic. I said earlier, the most vulnerable population was children under the age of 5. Probably the second most vulnerable population was children under the age of 10. Then the virus sort of receded in lethality, but then peaked. It was like a W. So it's up here high for the kids, goes down to teenagers, and then starts back up and peaks again at age 28, then goes down and ends up with the elderly. Unlike COVID, well over 90% of the excess mortality was people younger than 65. But that's actually not uncommon for a pandemic. The one we are still dealing with is the anomaly. We've got 6 pandemics we know something about: 1889, 1918, 1957, 1968, 2009. Every one of them, showed unusual deaths in younger people, not the elderly, although plenty of elderly died in those pandemics.
At that time, it seemed like there were medical professionals already who were recommending the social distancing, what we call now, right? And
Right.
they did same to the Army. Army couldn't do it or didn't listen. And there is one episode where the general, who his name is escaping me, committed suicide because presumably he caused. Do you think
that was at Camp Grant, when the 500th soldier at his camp, he had declined to follow some early advice from medical staff, and the 500th soldier died, and he ordered people out of his office and shot himself. Colonel Hagedorn, I do remember his name, even though the book's came out 20 years ago.
And it seemed like throughout that period, the scientists, they were trying to find the cure for the illness or a vaccine, right?
Yeah.
And throughout the book, there is one comment that they would sounded like they were searching for the wrong thing.
Or they didn't know what a virus was.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that they were very small organisms that passed through porcelain filters, but they weren't sure whether they were just really small bacteria or whether they were entirely different kind of organism. One of the scientific advances that came out of the pandemic would have happened eventually anyway, but I think the crush of research advanced that was a scientist named Thomas Rivers, who defined what a virus was early in the 20s. There are other very good science. I mean, they understood vaccines. They understood the basics of immunology. But for a vaccine to work, it has to be aimed at the right pathogen. There was a theory that a particular bacteria was the cause of the 1889 influenza pandemic, which may or may not have been caused by, and there's now an idea that that was actually a coronavirus that caused 1889. We can get into that later if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
But one of Robert Koch's disciples, a guy named Richard Pfeiffer, a brilliant scientist, thought it was a particular bacillus, which even today bears the name influenza, Haemophilus influenza, but it did not cause the influenza pandemic. It was one of the secondary invaders that could kill people. The virus, as I said earlier, stripped the immune system and allowed bacteria to get into the lung easily. That was one of the causes of death, but so were many other bacteria, including Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, and so forth. If you were developing a vaccine against that bacteria or one of the others, and you were fortunate enough that you were hit by a bacterial invader that happened to match that vaccine, it might have done some good, but it certainly didn't do anything against the virus itself.
There is some graphic description of what was happening in Philadelphia and some other cities on the peak. Can you walk through what was really happening on the field in the hospitals?
Well, every hospital was overwhelmed. Medical students were given charge of influenza hospitals. Philadelphia, I focused on in the book because it was one of the hardest hit cities. Obviously, for drama, you're going to take one of the worser places. The old saying among journalists, if it bleeds, it leads. And there was one medical student who later became a very prominent cardiologist who was working at an emergency hospital, basically tents set. Either in some cases they were tents with beds, in other cases they took over buildings. He was working at an emergency hospital, lived 12 miles away. This is in Philly. And in his drive home every night, there were so few cars on the road that he started counting them. And one night, in a drive of 12 miles in what was the third largest city in the country at the time, he didn't see one other car on the road. He said the life of the city is almost stopped. Now, actually friends of mine, whom I work with, they were at the National Security Council in the White House in the Bush administration, and some other people at CDC and University of Michigan were trying to figure out patterns. And I, of course, looked for these patterns as well. And I was unable. I saw a couple of patterns. The later in the pandemic, a city got infected. And even inside a city, the later you got hit by the pathogen, the better off you were. So it's pretty clear that the virus itself was changing and becoming less lethal. But there was also these people that I just mentioned. I'm not a quantitative guy. They were, and they figured out that cities that imposed various what we call today non-pharmaceutical interventions, social distancing, things like that. That cities that did that performed a little bit better than cities that did nothing. In fact, one of the reasons I was thrown off and didn't see that pattern, and I think they're right, I didn't see it because I knew what happened in Chicago and New York, and those two cities did nothing. And yet they had, I wouldn't call it a benign experience. New York had 33,000 deaths. It's not exactly benign, but in terms of per capita, it was nowhere near the worst. And Chicago was roughly in the same place. Neither of them ever closed schools or imposed masks or anything like that, or closed anything, really. So the fact that they had, relatively decent performances made it difficult for me to see. But it does seem that, the cities like St. Louis that closed things down early did benefit from that. And actually, a lot of the policies that were implemented early in 2020 are based on those findings.
In the book, you did mention, though, the San Francisco, I don't know whether they got lucky that.
San Francisco was different, not in terms of mortality. In fact, it was the hardest hit city on the West Coast. It's the only West Coast city that was in the top 10. What San Francisco did was tell the truth. Whereas in other cities, the local public health leaders are echoing what the national leaders said, that this is a direct quote. You heard it over and over. This is ordinary influenza by another name. But that's not what they did in San Francisco. In San Francisco, the elected officials, the medical community, trade unions, and the business community, all the leaders of those groups all put their names on a big ad that ran in the newspapers, huge type, said, wear a mask and save your life. Now, the reality is those masks didn't help much because they weren't good enough. But that is a very, very different message than this is ordinary influenza by another name. So when people were being lied to, there was alienation. And as I said earlier, in some places, almost a disintegration where people were literally starving to death because others were too frightened to bring them food. Nothing like that happened in San Francisco. The city continued to function. And I believe it continued to function because the leadership of the city told the people from the beginning this is a life and death matter. In most crises, in most emergencies, people come together and help each other. That was not happening in most of the country in 1918. I think it did happen in San Francisco. When schools were closed there, you had teachers volunteering as ambulance drivers. Well, that's a pretty risky job, but you didn't see, I'm not saying there weren't heroes in every city in the country. There were, but looking at society at large, I didn't see much of that outside of San Francisco.
Interesting. And eventually the virus receded, even though there was no medicine, no vaccine. Yeah. It's natural causes, right?
Correct. And infected everybody it was going to get, and moved on. There was another wave and another wave after that because the virus changed enough. The third wave in 1919 was, very deadly by any standard except the second wave in the fall. And then there was a fourth wave in 1920, which, was still in some cities was actually deadly, like Detroit, Milwaukee, a couple other places was worse than the fall wave in 1918. But by and large, it was not even as bad as the third wave. And by 1921, we were back to pre-pandemic mortality. I think that was a combination of the virus itself becoming less lethal, and obviously people's immune systems had seen it before. They were able to handle it better.
Back in 2020, when COVID just started, at what point did you realize that, oh boy, this looks very familiar?
Well, the middle of January 2020, I wrote an op-ed, which for the Washington Post in January, saying this virus cannot be contained. Actually, that was the working title. I pulled my punches on the title to say, turn that into a question. Can this virus be contained, when it was actually published? But I said, doesn't look like it. This looks like a big real thing. I think it was obvious really to anybody who knew much about pandemics. There were some medical professionals, including some whom I had high regard for, who in January and early February were still thinking, well, this isn't really that big a thing. But it seemed pretty obvious to me and to I have a lot of friends in the community that was preparing for a pandemic. They all saw it. Richard Hatchett, who runs the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and was one of the founders of COVAX, the effort to develop vaccines worldwide. He's in London now. He gave an interview saying, some pretty truthful but scary things. And I emailed him, congratulating him on the interview. He emailed me back and said he had been told that was a career-ending interview that he gave.
Wow.
Obviously, his career didn't end. He was right. I know, Mike Osterholm, for example, at University of Minnesota runs something called the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy. I mean, he knew it. He was going to 3M, telling them to make as many N95 masks as they possibly could make. He was doing that in middle January. As soon as it got outside Wuhan, I mean, there was no way. I mean, I think it was January, I forgot the exact date, but it was less than 2 weeks into January when it was in Thailand. There were cases in Thailand. It's outside China.
That's it, yeah. Wow.
And even before that, there was no way it was going to be contained.
What about the response that, as I was reading the book, it's like you can take out the word influenza, replace it with COVID, and a lot of it's going to be the same, as if we didn't learn anything. What's your take on that? What was similar? What was different between the handling of two pandemics?
Well, one thing that was different, you didn't have what I earlier said. Number one, 1918 was much more lethal. Number two, it hit a younger population. Already, to repeat myself, over 90%, well over 90% of the excess mortality were people younger than 65. Number three, the timing was totally different. The duration was totally different. So there was, in terms of intensity and horror, much, much worse in 1918. Like those early pictures of New York, refrigerated trucks for morgues and things like that. That was everywhere in the world in 1918, and worse. But in terms of the stress on the economy and maybe on society in a lot of ways, has been worse in COVID because it's lasted so much longer. It's a much slower moving virus, and it moves slower in every way. Another difference, there was no politicization in 1918.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't matter whether you were, what position you took politically. You knew this virus. Nobody was saying it was a fake. On the other hand, the government was lying to people in 1918, and we had some people who weren't exactly telling the truth this time around, coming from the government. That was different, and there was certainly no disinformation campaign, but the stresses were, again, in many ways greater in the last 4 years.
Your afterword in the book is, it's like almost prophetic. Like, it's basically said what would happen if we're not prepared, and you make multiple recommendations that you mentioned that a pandemic will come eventually. You do suggest to diversify from outsourcing medication, etc., to other countries, because every country going to be on their own. And what has been done in preparation to the pandemic, if anything?
Not much. Everybody's making this. The recommendations they were pretty obvious, and they're still obvious. And a couple of years ago, I was confident that public health would be well funded for, let's say a period of 3, 4, 5 years. And then when we got into the 6, 8, 10 years, out years, I was thinking we may run into trouble. I was incredibly over optimistic that, the desire to fund public health has already disappeared. And in fact, powers of public health authorities have been limited in more than half the states, which is exactly the wrong way to go. People are talking about greater surveillance. Maybe there'll be some more money put into that. Probably will be. All these efforts take money. It's in a lot of ways, it's as if we haven't learned anything. The recommendations are, I wrote 5 epilogues or afterwards for that book, actually, to keep it updated. First, when the original one, then H5N1, so-called bird flu surfaces. So I wrote one for that. And then 2009, so I wrote one for that. And then the 100th anniversary of the pandemic, people will celebrate the anniversary of anything, including 50 million dead. So I wrote one for that. And then I wrote one more recently, which I actually wish I hadn't written, because I wrote it and, toward the end of the first year of COVID, and, some of it's already dated. But the most important thing remains true, and the ending of every one of the afterwards was exactly the same. That the most important thing in any crisis, not just a pandemic, tell the truth. You don't manage the truth, you tell the truth. I think people can deal with the truth a lot better than they deal with lies. And, information is the most important non-pharmaceutical intervention, and both ways, both in gathering it and in disseminating it. The British have a system which allowed them to correlate some outcomes with some treatments. And prior to the vaccine, by far the most successful medical intervention came out of their correlating information, which was dexamethasone, which saved millions of lives worldwide. It's a dirt cheap steroid. We don't have anything like that in the United States. We were basing our decisions on information we were getting, not just from the United Kingdom or Israel, which we regard as very advanced scientific countries, but also from South Africa and Qatar, who were not generally regarded as leading scientific communities. And their information was good. They have good scientists there. But why is the United States making decisions based on what's happening in Qatar South Africa, Israel, and the United Kingdom. Where is our own information gathering and correlating capability? We don't have one. So that's one side of the information equation. Of course, the other side is disseminating it. We obviously had, active players, including, Iran and Russia and so forth, who were trying very hard to spread lies here. And then we had our own domestic people who probably didn't know that they were spreading lies, probably believed what they were saying, but were sadly, badly misinformed. So clearly you need much more of an effort than just any particular individual standing up at a microphone and giving out information. You need a really robust, energetic effort to get correct information out there and counter the nonsense that's being spread.
That's great. I have one last question for you, John. So you've read many books, and which one?
Not that many, unfortunately. I'm trying.
But which one of the ones you have already written should people read next after Influenza?
Well, honestly, I think my best book is called Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul, Church, State, and the Birth of Liberty. And I can tell you I do not have a financial interest in that book because that will never pay back the advance. I think so. The publisher may see some more money for it, but I won't. It was a nice advance. I really think that's my best book. It's set in the 17th century. Roger Williams was the first person to articulate in a modern way the separation of church and state. And ironically, he was a Puritan minister. He was so well regarded that the day he arrived in Boston, soon after the Boston colony was founded, he was offered the ministry of the Boston church, and he turned it down because they weren't pure enough for him. And he's pretty well known for the separation of church and state. And he went on to found Rhode Island. He's less well known for really articulating, again, in a modern way, the sense of individual freedom and looking at the role of the individual versus the state. And he was a protege of someone you probably never heard of, Sir Edward Coke, who was the Chief Justice of England, probably the greatest justice in English history. Coke pioneered such things as judicial review of legislative acts, using habeas corpus. But one thing he said that every American above the age of 5 knows, even though they never heard of Edward Coke: the house of every Englishman is as his castle. Everybody knows that saying. He ruled that from the bench when there were great lords with real castles, not to mention a king with powerful. And he was saying that this peasant in the mud hut, he's got the same rights as his lord in the castle with the private army when it comes to the state and his rights when the state tries to do something to him. And of course, for that, the king threw him in the Tower of London, where Coke, who was quite a character, said, if the king desires my head, he knows where he may find it. He was not executed, but he was ended up being released. Anyway, that idea of individual freedom ran through Roger Williams' veins, and I think was a factor in how he developed his. I know it was a factor. He says himself how much it mattered in the development of his own views.
John, thank you very much for your time. It was fantastic talking to you.
Okay, well, it was fun.